All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Terrific. Well, thank you so much to SCWIST and is it SWIST or SCWIST? I've been thinking SWIST.
SCWIST.
SCWIST.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you all today and to run not just this workshop, but the whole series of workshops with you all. I'll be working with you 3 weeks in a row, which is really exciting. So I'm really excited to get to know you all and get to know a little bit more about your work and your interests in science and to explore science communication with you. So I am recording this workshop at the request of the host. And so the recordings for all 3 of the workshops will be available to view for a month after each event. All right, so I will go ahead and share my screen. Oh, and just a quick note, during the breakout sessions, during the workshops, those will not be recorded. So any brainstorming that you're doing privately with your partner will not be included in the recording. And on that note, we will also be having a number of breakout sessions throughout the workshop in which we'll be working with partners and brainstorming together. So I encourage you all to participate actively in this workshop and be paying attention throughout the 2-hour time frame because it'll run a lot more smoothly if everybody's ready to jump in actively to those breakout sessions as soon as we launch them. All right, and now I'll share my screen with you. Great, so you should all be seeing my title slide with the live captions going. And if that is not the case, please let me know in the chat. All right, so hello everybody, my name is Sarah El-Shafy. I am a science storytelling coach and a global change biologist. I am the founder and principal of Science Through Story LLC. I am also a doctoral candidate in the Department of Integrative Biology and the Museum of Paleontology at the University of California, Berkeley. And this is the first in our series of Science Through Story workshops. Our workshop today is about engaging broad audiences. So a quick note, if you would like to post on social media about this workshop, please feel free to take a screenshot of this title slide and feel free to share that on the intranet. And also, if you have not yet had a chance to download the 2 files that we'll be using in our workshop today, there's a worksheet and also a set of abstracts, and those files are both shared in the chat right now. So if you haven't yet downloaded them, please take a moment to do so. All right, as I said, you're welcome to share the title slide on social media, but please don't post anything past this slide on the intranet. We ask that you keep the rest of this content for your use only. If you want to take some screenshots during the rest of the presentation for your own reference, you're welcome to do so, but please just keep those private and don't share them on the internet. Thank you so much. All right, well, this is a workshop about storytelling. This whole series is about storytelling. So I thought I would start by sharing a bit with you about my own story. I grew up at the intersection of 2 cultures. My father is from Egypt and my mother is from the US, specifically rural Maryland. Thus, I have spent much of my life learning how to communicate between people with very different experiences and worldviews. I've also always been passionate about animals and nature. I went to college to study science and I got really interested in fossils and Earth history. And I wanted to become a paleontologist. I was really excited about doing the science, but I was even more excited to share that science with other people. I was especially excited to tell my family about the work that I was doing. Half of my family, as I mentioned, lives in rural Maryland, and many of them are farmers. Every summer, when there isn't a pandemic, we have a big family reunion, and I always enjoy hearing their stories about farm life. One summer, they asked me what I was working on. And whatever came out of my mouth, I could tell that it sounded like total gibberish to them. I'm guessing maybe a few of you can relate to this situation. Now, I thought long and hard about this. And I realized that it wasn't that my family couldn't understand what I do. They're very smart people. The problem was that I was not making it relatable for them. I was failing to put it in a meaningful context for my family members. So I thought about, well, how could I fix this? When I thought about how my family members relate to each other, I realized that they share their life experiences through stories. We all do this every day. We tell each other stories about our lives. So maybe that would be a better starting point for talking about science. I realized that I needed to become a better storyteller. So I turned to some master storytellers for guidance. I had been a huge fan of Pixar films my whole life, and it just so happened that Pixar Animation Studios was close to our campus here in Berkeley, California. So I reached out to their professional storytellers and got a response. They were really excited to talk to scientists as well. And I started learning from them. I thought about how to tell stories about my science rather than just spewing out facts. When I saw my family again the following summer, I told them stories about my work. They were able to follow along, and they indeed thought it was awesome. And ever since then, I have been offering workshops to help other scientists and science educators share their work through stories. So it comes down to this. Science is a search for evidence, but science communication is a search for meaning. When we're doing science, we try to be as objective as possible and analyze just the empirical data without bringing our own biases into it. But really, it's not possible to remove your own biases completely, of course, because it's still a human endeavor. Now, especially with communicating science, objectivity is not going to get you very far because we are creatures of meaning. We search for meaning in everything. We need meaning to make sense of things and make sense of the world around us. So when we're talking about science, we have to put science into a meaningful context for the people that we are trying to reach. So today is all about how can we make science meaningful for others? How can we relate to each other? And indeed, that will be the theme of this entire series of workshops. How can we make science meaningful for other people through stories? Let's start by thinking for a moment about why we tell stories. Why are we using storytelling specifically as the backbone for our communication? Well, research actually shows that there is a neurological basis to how stories affect the brain. In this study, 2 participants were hooked up to fMRI machines to monitor their brain activity. In the first round, a speaker told a listener, that's the first line of brain scans, a story, and their brain activity overlapped. Those are the areas in orange that you see highlighted. Then in the second round, the listener from the first round recounted that same story to another listener, also hooked up to an fMRI. That's the second line of brain scans. Their respective brain activity still reflected that of the original storyteller. That's the areas highlighted in color that you see in that second line of brain scans. So whether someone was telling the story, hearing the story, retelling that story, or hearing the story retold, the same areas of the brain were active. This is exactly what was happening when I just told you my story a moment ago. I was essentially syncing all of your brain waves to mine. So stories have an observable effect on the brain. This study and many others indicate that audiences process and recall new information more efficiently if the content is structured as a narrative. Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, describes the human brain as functioning on 2 metaphorical systems. System 1, which works very quickly, and system 2, which is slower and takes a lot more energy. System 1, the story brain, if you will, is always on. It's always processing sensory inputs and trying to organize them into a story of what's going on. Whereas system 2 is more like a fancy calculator that we pull out when the problem gets hard and needs heavy logic and analysis. Now, we can only use system 2 in short bursts. In the pauses between bursts of analysis, we fall back to system 1, the story processor. So training in a scientific discipline is a bit like putting your system 2 through martial arts training. You learn the karate of logic, the judo of critical thinking, the kung fu of statistics. But your audience won't necessarily have that same training. And they shouldn't need it to understand the main point of your work if you're communicating it well. If you can speak to your audience's story brains, they won't need the mental martial arts to understand you. So with this in mind, let's start by thinking about how we can connect with our audience, starting by thinking about how we can connect with our own science at a personal level. So here we're going to get into our breakout rooms for the first time pretty soon. But first, we're going to take a moment to think about some of our own favorite stories. So I'd like all of you right now, this is the first sheet of your worksheet if you're using the worksheet, list some of your favorite stories. Don't overthink it, just some of the first stories that come to mind that you'd never get tired of, no matter how many times you've enjoyed them already. Could be films, books, TV shows, family anecdotes, songs, whatever you like. List a few of your favorite stories. And then think about, what do these stories have in common? Or what do maybe some of them have in common? Do they have similar themes, similar characters? Do they take place in similar settings? Do they come from similar genres? Do they have similar events? what are some commonalities between them? And then ask yourself, do those commonalities relate to my own work in any way? Maybe the theme of some of your favorite stories relates to the topic of the work that you do. Or maybe the roles that some of your favorite characters take on are similar to the role that you've taken on in your own career. Do those commonalities relate to your work in any way? Take 3 minutes to think through this on your own, jot down some ideas, and then we'll get into our breakout rooms. Okay, so now we're going to get into breakout rooms in pairs. And in your breakout rooms, I'd like you to share your list of favorite stories with each other and see if maybe you have some favorite stories in common or some themes in common. Share with your partner what you observed about commonalities between your favorite stories and what you, and share with your partner if you don't know them already, just briefly what kind of work you do or what kind of role you're in and any parallels that you may have seen between the work that you do and the commonalities between some of your favorite stories, or see if maybe your partner picks up on something that you hadn't noticed yet. And if your partner isn't familiar with any of your stories, don't take 10 minutes to explain the whole story. You could just bring them up to speed in a couple sentences, generally what the story is about. So we're going to take 10 minutes to discuss our stories in pairs, and then we'll regroup. And I'm going to open the breakout rooms now, so you should all be getting an invitation soon to join your breakout rooms. And I'm going to pause the recording. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed that. It's a fun warm-up activity and also a nice icebreaker. So I'd like you to think about whether you found anything interesting on your list, anything surprising. Were there any surprising connections that you came across? Or alternatively, anything that wasn't surprising? Did you look at your list and the commonalities and go, yep, that makes total sense. That pretty much sums me up. Think about it. And if you'd like to share any of your observations in the chat, please go ahead and do so. And meanwhile, I'll share with you a bit about what I discovered the first time that I did this exercise. When I first considered it, I thought, well, would this be too elementary for a professional development workshop? I don't know, but it sounds fun anyway, so why not? So I tried it out. I tried listing some of my favorite stories, and I came up with this list. I'm a huge movie buff, so I listed some of the first movies that came to my head that I just never get tired of watching. And when I looked at this list, I thought, there seems to be, a lot of titles on there that have to do with the relationship between humans and nature, and especially what happens when that relationship is strained or abused. That's interesting. Well, does that have anything to do with the work that I do? Well, I actually study how climate change affects life over time. That is interesting. Climate change is essentially the story of the relationship between humans and nature being thrown out of whack. And trying to address climate change is our attempt to restore some balance to that relationship. I had never thought about it in those terms before I did this, but ever since, it has completely reframed how I think about not just my work and why it's meaningful to me, but also how I communicate with other people about the work that I do. Now, depending on the audience that I'm trying to reach, I might not start my story every single time with climate change is the story of our relationship with nature being upset and us trying to restore some balance to it. But even if I don't say that explicitly every time, if I start from that mindset, thinking about why is this personally relevant to me, whatever comes out of my mouth after that is going to be more accessible than if I'm only thinking about the facts that I need to communicate. So I encourage you to revisit this exercise from time to time. Keep thinking about your favorite stories and what they have in common, why those stories are meaningful to you, and what they might have in common with the work that you do. So listing your favorite stories, commonalities, and then think about whether you can use any of those connections to discuss your interests with others. So with that in mind, let's now think about how we can consider our audience, the audience that we're trying to reach. Any communicator will tell you the most important thing in communication is to remember your audience. Think about who it is that you're trying to reach with your content. And of course, what does that audience care about? The more you can narrow down your audience, the better you can tailor your story. But even if you're trying to reach a broad, general public audience, let's say, what are some things that we could probably safely assume that a general audience would care about? And please enter your suggestions in the chat. In general, what are some things that most people care about, no matter who they are or where they come from? What are some things that you all care about, that your friends and family would also care about? Share your thoughts in the chat. Great. Safety, security, community. What else? Lives and wellness, well-being, family. Great. What else? What are some things that affect everybody? Relevance to society, happiness, health. Good. More. What else? Money. Great. Success stories. What else? What are some things that affect our daily lives? Politics. Awesome. In general, no matter who you're talking to, you can pretty safely assume that they're going to care about the economy, money, someone mentioned, safety and health, many people mentioned, especially these days during a pandemic, of course, policy and politics, anything that affects our daily lives, our future. Most people care about the continuation of human beings. Proximity. If I can tie what I'm talking about to your particular experience, if I can tie it to the work of SCWIST, if I can tie it to Canada, if I can tie it to science or whatever particular field of science that you do, then I'm going to have your attention a little bit more than if I'm talking generally about things that don't connect to your daily life. And of course, wow, everyone likes a good wow factor. The biggest thing, the oldest that, superlatives always get people's attention. Now, in addition to thinking about who is our audience and what do they care about, it's very important to think about what is your goal? What is your communication goal for that audience? What is the number one thing that you want them to take away from your communication with them? You probably have a lot of things that they want to take away, that you want them to take away from your story. But if you had to choose just one to focus on, what would it be? Invariably, when I'm preparing to communicate something and I find myself getting stuck or lost trying to figure out how to focus it, it's always because I'm trying to accomplish too much at once. And when that happens, I force myself to write down every single thing that I want people to get out of what I'm telling them. From the most specific to the most ridiculous. Could be, I want them to understand my research and I want them to care about the stuff I worked on and I want them to see that it's important and I want them to think I'm cool and that I'm smart and I want them to give me a job or give me a grant. I want them to keep coming to my workshops, whatever it is, write it all down and then pick one thing on that list to prioritize. Because you will be surprised how many of those other things you could actually subsume without even trying into your story, but focusing on just one thing is going to make it a lot easier to narrow down the focus and make your story more effective. So let's brainstorm together right now. What if well, actually, let me ask you all. Can you suggest some audiences that you might need to reach on a regular basis? Who are some specific audiences that you typically need to reach in your own communications of science? Family, great. Managers, students, Indigenous communities, college students, undergrads, law enforcement, advisors, peers, students, women in STEM, great. Lots of suggestions. Thank you. So whatever you just suggested, I would like you to keep one or more, actually keep one, pick one of those audiences that you'd like to keep in the back of your mind and think about what would that audience particularly care about? And what would your primary communication goal be for that audience, that particular audience, if you were communicating to them? All right, so now with these audiences in mind, let's think about how we can relate science to people's experiences and core values. Let's think about how we can engage our audience. Starting with this concept of pairing ordinary with extraordinary. I love to use the example of the film The Incredibles here, because when Pixar was making this film, the director Brad Bird's #1 rule for every single scene in this film was every scene must have something both ordinary and something extraordinary put side by side, occurring together. So The Incredibles is about a family living in the suburbs, but the family members are all superheroes. They all have superpowers, but they're trying to live a normal life and blend in with society, which is a hilarious premise and very entertaining. So in every single scene, something ordinary has to happen, but their superpowers also have to come into it in some way. If they're having dinner around the table, the kids get into a fight, and of course they start using their superpowers to fight with each other. And then the parents have to use their superpowers to break up the fight. If mom is chasing down bad guys on her super bike, her kid has to call her and say, "Mom, I can't find my shoes. Where would my shoes be?" Ordinary with extraordinary. We can absolutely apply this to thinking about science. Here's an article, a story that just came out a couple weeks ago. Amazing story about this incredible specimen of a wolf pup mummy, naturally mummified from the Arctic. It was found in melting permafrost. Yields secrets of how a 6-week-old wolf puppy lived and died. Amazing, amazing find. So this is an easy one. In what ways is this extraordinary? It's an incredibly preserved wolf pup mummy. Anybody who studies ancient stuff of any kind would be super, super jazzed about this. But let's think about people who are not scientists, who might not think about old stuff or old life on a daily basis. What might the average person find ordinary? In other words, relatable. What might they find interesting about this? Or first of all, how could they relate to this story? If you showed this to a kid, what would that kid probably immediately pick up on? Even if they don't know anything about fossils or natural mummies. Yeah, most people like dogs. It's a puppy. Oh my gosh, it's a puppy. Great. Very ordinary, very relatable. But what's extraordinary about it? This puppy is 56,000 years old. That's incredible. So pairing ordinary with extraordinary. We can also ask the question, what if? What if questions are playful, imaginative? They don't need to be serious. They can be literal or figurative. Stories are driven by what if questions. Children respond to more direct questions. Teens and adults find higher concept questions more compelling, and a good story will have layers of both. So for example, what if you had superpowers, but you weren't allowed to be super? What if you had to manage being a superhero while also trying to raise a family? Anyone trying to balance a career with a personal life could really relate to that. How about Toy Story? What if your toys came to life when you weren't looking? Which makes this story incredibly relatable for kids. What if you had to cooperate with your worst enemy? What if your fear of being replaced became real? Something many adults can relate to. What if a rat became the top chef at a gourmet French restaurant? What if you weren't welcome in the one place that you most wanted to be? Starting with a question is less intimidating, and it also invites your audience into the story. It's much more inviting and participatory than starting with an answer. So let's apply this to thinking about science. I put this example of elephants up because a colleague of mine once asked me, "Hey, Sarah, I'm working on a talk about my research for an anatomy conference coming up. And I'm tired of giving the same old conference, the same old talk over and over. I want to spice it up a bit. Can you help me out?" Well, sure. What do you work on? I study the evolution of craniofacial musculature in pachyderms. In other words, he studied the evolution of facial muscles in mammals with thick skin, specifically elephants. Okay, cool. So why elephants? I don't know. I've just always liked elephants since I was a kid. Okay, but why elephants? Why not tigers or lizards or scorpions? What's always fascinated you about elephants in particular? He really thought about it for a minute, and he finally said, I guess I've always wondered what it would be like to have to eat without using hands. What if you had to eat without using hands? What if you could pick stuff up with your nose? What if you could do something really cool that highlights a unique feature or ability of your subject? Or what if you had to do this thing in a different way? So connecting the experience of your subject to the experience of your audience. What if you had to eat without using hands? What if you had to see without using eyes? What if you had to think without using a brain? What if you had to communicate without speech or body language? So that's a really great way to engage your audience, activate their imaginations, and get them engaged in what you're talking about. Or alternatively, you could go the other way around. What if this thing didn't exist? What would the world look like without your subject? What if there were no elephants? How would the world be different? Or what if there were no zoos? I gave a workshop at Disney's Animal Kingdom at Disney World in Orlando, Florida once. And this is a question that they actually are faced with a lot, because a lot of people don't think that zoos should exist. So how can they engage people in talking about what zoos do offer, the value of having zoos in the world? Well, what if there were no zoos? Would we be better off, or would we be missing something? Interesting question. So let's come back to this wolf pup mummy example. What are some what if questions that we could maybe ask to engage an audience with this story? What if, again, please share your thoughts in the chat. What if you found a 56,000-year-old puppy? It was still a puppy, but it's 56,000 years old. What if you found a puppy, maybe not what if you found a puppy buried in your backyard? That might traumatize some kids, but what if you found a 56,000-year-old puppy? What if you're speaking to adults or especially to scientists, what if you could take direct samples from an animal that lived thousands of years ago? Usually impossible, but in this case, it was possible. That's amazing. All right, now let's think about an example that's close to the work of many of you. I understand many of you are physical anthropologists. And I was actually asked specifically to use an example that has to do with decomposition, so that we can think about how might we discuss decomposition, especially with kids, in a way that wouldn't freak them out. Great. So here's a study that I pulled out of Soil Biology and Biochemistry. Really cool study about mortality hotspots, nitrogen cycling in forest soils during vertebrate decomposition. So let's take a minute to read this abstract, and this is in your the file with the 3 abstracts that I shared with all of you, and I can put that in the chat again, just to make sure you've all had a chance to download it. Please take a minute to read this abstract. Okay, so now we're going to get back into our breakout rooms, and we're going to brainstorm this abstract with our partners. I'd like you to consider together, first of all, choose an audience that you would like to reach, a target audience that you'd like to use for this exercise. It could be one of the audiences that we brainstormed in the chat together earlier, or you could agree together on an audience that you'd like to use. Public audience, professional audience, colleagues, kids, anything. Choose an audience that you're trying to reach. Actually, I take that back. Specifically, well, you could think about both. Actually, I encourage you, think about a technical audience, like maybe peers in your field that you might be communicating to, and then also think about a general audience, like a group of kids, a group of second graders, for example. Choose a couple target audiences, one technical, one general, and then think about what is both ordinary and what is extraordinary about this study. What is extraordinary and what is relatable about this study that you could point out to these target audiences? And what are some fun what if questions that you could ask to get that audience engaged? Like, what if you could do this in a different way? Or what if this thing didn't exist? Or what if this seemingly impossible thing was suddenly possible? You might be able to use the same what if questions for both audiences, or point out the same ordinary, extraordinary things for both audiences. So we're going to get back in our breakout rooms, and we'll take about 7 minutes to work on this in pairs. And I'm going to open the breakout rooms again now. You may or may not end up in the same breakout room, but I'll shuffle people around if I need to make sure that everybody is in a group of, it might be 2 or 3 this time. Okay, welcome back. So now that you've had some time to think about this together, I'd love to hear what some of you came up with. If anybody would like to share their ordinary or extraordinary ideas in the chat, or if you'd like to share your what if questions in the chat. Let's start with maybe, did anybody have Well, I guess a lot of you were thinking about both. So what were some ordinary or extraordinary things that we could point out about this study to a technical audience, to an audience of other scientists? What would other scientists find relatable or extraordinary about this study? Please enter your suggestions in the chat, or if you like, feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to speak with the group. And in addition to ordinary, extraordinary, what were some what if questions that you thought might engage a group of scientists? Great, ordinary, compost. We're all familiar with compost. What else? What else might be ordinary about this? To a group of scientists. Dead animals, sure. Animals dying is a perfectly natural, normal thing. Nutrient recycling, great. Ordinary, soil is everywhere. Death is ordinary, great. Extraordinary, extraordinary cycle of life. Hiking and seeing animals not moving in the forest, that's ordinary. Ordinary bugs, bugs involved in decomposition. Great, I see some what if questions. What if you were hiking in the woods and you see a deer horn? How did it get that way? Cool, great, because hiking is ordinary and seeing bones on the trail is ordinary. Ordinary in general, rotting food in the fridge, garbage. Extraordinary, dramatic change in soil biodiversity. Great, some more what if questions here. What if things that died did not decompose? So what if decomposition didn't happen? Or what if you could turn into flowers? I like that one. What if you could turn into flowers? What would the plant biodiversity look like in a traditional American cemetery with extensive body preservation processes versus a Muslim cemetery where there's no body preservation processes? Very interesting question, because the Muslim tradition is you just wrap the body in a piece of cloth. Very interesting. What if soil could be evidence of war crimes, mass graves, body disposal, etc.? Also very interesting question. Great, lots of good ideas here. Okay, awesome. Now, how about for an audience of kids or another general audience that you might have thought of? What are some ordinary, a lot of these ordinary, extraordinary things you've pointed out would apply equally to a general audience, like decomposition or things dying being a natural thing. Animal zombies, that's fun. What else? Roadkill, right, everybody's seen roadkill on the side of the road. What else? Compost, that was something that pretty much anybody would be able to relate to, including a lot of kids. How about some what if questions? What are some what if questions that we could use to engage kids or other general audiences? What if you were a baby bug and eating rotten meat was your idea of a delicious meal? That's hilarious. I love it. Ordinary, decomposition, extraordinary, death supporting life. What if plants ate animals? I love that. It's so simple, but gets right at the point. What if plants actually ate animals? Sounds counterintuitive, but that's exactly what's going on. I love this. Great, great suggestions. When I thought through this, I came up with very similar ideas. I thought ordinary, I would point out that death is a normal part of life. But what's extraordinary, decomposition enriches soil, which helps forests. So decomposition is actually helping the forest to thrive. And some what if questions I had, I also thought, what if there was no decomposition? The planet would not function nearly as well without decomposition, both because the soil wouldn't get enriched and also because there would be dead bodies everywhere. I also thought about if I was talking to a group of kids specifically, I might ask them, have any of you ever lost a pet? Me too. Both of the kitties that I grew up with have since passed away. We buried the kitties in the backyard of the home where I grew up. Now, what if I told you that my kitties who passed away actually helped the trees in my backyard grow? So that's similar to a lot of what if questions that you had. What if you could turn into flowers? I really like that one. What if I told you that my kitties actually helped my trees grow? So that puts it in a much more positive light and also connects it to something that maybe the child can relate to, losing a pet. So lots of great ideas. Thank you for sharing. So at this point, I'd like to pause and ask, what questions do we have? Not what if questions for your audience. What questions do we collectively have about what we've been talking about thus far? We've covered a lot of ground already. thinking about why use storytelling, what storytelling means to us, using storytelling, thinking about stories to connect with our own work, thinking about how we can connect with and engage our audiences. What questions do we have at this point? Here's a question. I'm wondering how we can relate this to short interactions with strangers about science. Great question. Great question. I think any of this, any of the things that we've talked about, you could absolutely use to engage a stranger with science. And we're going to get into some more things in the second part of the workshop that you could use to initiate a conversation. But what we just talked about, ordinary and extraordinary, what if questions, that's a great way to start a conversation, especially with a stranger. What if you could turn into a plant? Or what if you could turn into a plant? Or what if plants ate animals? That's a really fun, simple, but effective question that would get anybody interested. Wait, what? Plants eating animals? What are you talking about? Great way to reframe something that would otherwise seem really complex. How else can we use this engaging with strangers? Certainly taking some time in advance to think about your favorite stories and how you connect with them and how that might connect with your own work. So putting your own work in a meaningful context to you, that could help you have a conversation with anybody you might meet. If you ask them, what kind of stories do you like? Really, I love adventure stories too. That's one of the things that I really enjoy about my work. So putting the work of science in an immediately more relatable context for that person. Because a lot of people think about science as this abstract, complex, convoluted thing that you need a special membership card to be a part of. And one of the best things we can do is to break down that stereotype and emphasize that, no, anybody can do science. Yeah, you can get some training to do it at a more sophisticated level, but really science is just about asking questions and making observations. So great question. Another question, how can we use storytelling in the published literature to make articles more interesting to read? Oh, fantastic question. How can we apply any of this to publishing scientific articles and make published literature more interesting to read? Thank you for that question. Well, I'll just start by offering that any of these things could absolutely apply to a scientific paper. Ordinary, extraordinary, what if questions. What if questions don't always, I mean, even putting a sort of abstract what if question into a scientific paper can be really effective if it's used strategically. You know, you could actually put that into the introduction. What if this or what if that? But even if you don't feel like that would be appropriate for the technical writing that you have to do, you can still think about pairing ordinary with extraordinary. Here's what we would have expected to see, but here's what we were surprised by. That's another way of framing ordinary with extraordinary. And on the subject of applying storytelling to technical papers, we're going to get into some stuff in the second part of the workshop that will definitely apply to that. And especially next week when we talk about science story development in our second workshop, we're going to be talking explicitly about how to use story structure in technical papers. So thank you for that question. And I hope you can pin that question because we're going to come back to it several times. Some more questions coming in here. How can you convince, for example, an anti-vaxxer that science is good and not evil? Awesome question. Thank you for bringing that up. Obviously, a very timely question. How can we convince people who don't want to get vaccines that science is good and not evil? We're actually going to return to that question several times. For now, I'll say ordinary, extraordinary, what if? I bet you could come up with a what if question that might intrigue that anti-vaxxer. Not necessarily convince them on the spot, because that's unlikely. But if you can at least engage them in a conversation, that might be the most important thing. You said it yourself, convincing the anti-vaxxer that science is good and not evil. Not even that you should get a vaccine, but that science is good and not evil. If that anti-vaxxer thinks that science is evil, there's probably a reason for it. There was probably something in that person's prior experience that made them really averse to science and scientists. Maybe something that had nothing to do with science itself. So if you can simply have a conversation with that person and demonstrate to them, going back to when we were thinking about our audience, think about what they care about and make it clear that you care about those same things. You also care about the well-being of your friends and family. You also care about the economy and safety and health. you also care about having the freedom to do what you want in life, then you can establish that you are just a human being who cares about the same things that that person cares about. And if you can do that, you might be the first scientist that that person has actually had a chance to talk to, that they realize, oh, this person actually cares about the same things. And maybe that person would be more likely then to see the next scientist that they encounter as not someone nefarious with a hidden agenda, but just another human being who cares about the same things that they do. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do as communicators, just establish that we are human beings who care about the same things. Again, putting science in a meaningful context. We're going to come back to that same question again, especially in our third workshop on visual science storytelling. We'll actually look at an example that addresses this exact issue of COVID vaccines. So thank you for that question. Another question here. I often struggle with what details I share with others when telling stories. To me, at least, while I'm telling a story, almost every detail matters, but then I realize later that they don't. I hear you. How do we choose what to tell and what to leave out so we don't lose our audience? Fantastic question. How do we figure out which details are actually important to share and which details are not, when to us, all the details are important? Great question. We are going to address that exact dilemma in the second half of the workshop. So keep that question in mind. How to use storytelling to help audience with simple and succinct take-home points. We're going to talk about that a lot in the second half of the workshop too. So I'm going to pin that question as well. Great, fantastic questions so far. Thank you so much for getting this dialogue going. So at this point, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We've covered a lot of ground so far. So take 5, take a bio break, stand up, stretch, move your head around, get the creative juices flowing again, and we will regroup in 5 minutes. So I've got 11:17 on my clock. So if you're on Eastern time, 2:17, I have to convert between time zones so much more now. Yeah, so we will regroup in 5 minutes at 11:22 or 2:22. All right, see you all in 5. Okay, welcome back. Before we proceed, I'd like to take a step back for a moment to thinking about our audiences. We skipped this slide before, but I want to come back to it now that we've thought about how we would frame things for different audiences. When you're thinking about the audience you're trying to reach, you might not have just one specific demographic, especially if you're trying to reach a wide audience that might include lots of different kinds of people. So in that case, it can help to think about reference audiences. People that might be encountering your communication. And if you can think specifically about one or more people that might make up the demographic that you're trying to reach, perhaps the most disparate, the most different people that might be receiving your communication, and think about what those people care about and what they would respond to and find relatable, then that can really help. Because if you can triangulate your communication between those different people, then you're most likely to offer something that will touch all of them. And you'll probably also capture a lot of audience in between those reference audiences. So that's another thing that you can think about. And that's mentioned on page 2 of your worksheet, which talks about the audiences. By the way, you don't have to be answering every single question in this worksheet as we go. This is meant for your reference. It can be helpful as we go through this workshop today, but this is especially meant to be a resource for you after this workshop so that you can revisit a lot of these concepts and use this in your own work. Okay. Now let's move into the second part of the workshop, distilling stories. A good story cannot be devised, it has to be distilled. This is one of my favorite quotes from Raymond Chandler, a gumshoe detective novelist. Science storytelling is not about making stuff up or injecting narrative into science. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, storytelling is a process of taking a large amount of material and distilling from it the most cogent, the most cohesive, the most compelling version of that story that you could possibly tell for a given audience in a given context with a particular goal in mind. So let's think about how to distill, starting with how do we distill our main point? And this comes back to the question about how do we decide which information is the most important to share? Here's how we can start. What is the main point of your story. Again, think about your primary communication goal for the audience that you're trying to reach. With that communication goal in mind, what is the main point of your story? You might have your own idea about what the main point of your story is, but you also have to consider what is the main point of your story for your target audience. For example, this is a figure from my own dissertation work that I am completing right now at the University of California, Berkeley. My dissertation looks at how climate change impacts animals over time, specifically lizards living in the western interior of the US over a span of about 40 million years. So this figure shows body size in lizards, all lizards in this region over time, over about 40 million years, compared to mean average temperature in that region over time. So comparing body size to temperature, I find that they actually do track each other, which is really cool. Please don't share that because this isn't published yet. Now, when I'm sharing this work with other paleontologists, scientists in my field, the main point that I want to convey to them might be that lizard body size tracked environmental temperature over 40 million years. Paleontologists would find that super cool. If I'm speaking to a broader group of biologists, from all different kinds of specializations, the main point that I want to make will be a bit broader. Lizard body size correlates with temperature both today and in the past. It's not just broader, it also ties to biology today because not all of those biologists will be working on fossils. If I'm speaking to the general public, maybe at a big science festival, for example, then I'm going to zoom out even more. The main point might simply be, we can use the past to predict the future. Obviously, this is very broad, but it's clear and it's relatable. I can offer more details now that I have people's attention. So let's revisit this abstract one that we looked at earlier about nitrogen cycling in soil from decomposition. What is the main point here for a specialist audience like yourselves? What might be the main point that you would want to convey? Or rather, what do you think is the main point that these scientists wanted to convey to other scientists? Please share your thoughts in the chat. What did you interpret to be the main point of this study? What was the main point that the authors wanted to convey to you all as scientists? What was the most important thing? I think many of you touched on it, what I would consider to be the main point. Many of you touched on this already in your brainstorming earlier about what if questions and ordinary, extraordinary. The authors actually summarize it. I didn't include it in this screenshot, but here are the highlight bullet points that the authors actually included with the paper. Recycling of nutrients, nutrient turnover, comprehensive review of temporal changes in nitrogen biogeochemical cycling during vertebrate decay. Yep, exactly, great. So it's spelled out there at the bottom. Decaying carrion results in rapid and long-lived nitrogen enrichment in soil. In other words, decomposition of vertebrate carcasses is actually a really important factor in nitrogen enrichment of the soil. Great, so that's the main point for a technical audience. Now, if we were talking to a group of kids, or if these scientists were going to present on their work to a group of kids, what might be the main point to that audience of kids? They're probably not going to focus on nitrogen enrichment and soil nutrient cycling in soils. That might be a bit above the kids' heads. But the kids are probably, as you said, they're familiar with roadkill, they're familiar with pets dying, they're familiar with compost, and they're familiar with plants growing. So the main point for kids might simply be, when animals decompose, they help the forest grow. Roadkill can actually help plants grow. Awesome. Same main point, essentially, but framed a little bit differently for the kids. So with the scientists, we were focusing more on the soil enrichment, the nutrient cycling, the isotopes and such. But for the kids, it's just simply dead animals help plants grow. Death is important to life. Great, thanks. What happens to pets when they die and we bury them in the backyard? Awesome. So once we've distilled our main point, and I encourage you to do that before you start writing the story. Think about, what is the communication goal that I have with this audience? Maybe for the kids, it's that I want them to understand that death is important to life. I want them to understand decomposition and not be freaked out by it. If that was your main goal, then distill your main point that you want to get across to them. Death is part of life. Dead animals actually help plants grow. Great. Now let's think about how to distill our story. How do we actually build a story out of this? We're going to think about how to distill a short form story. For example, a story that you could use to initiate a conversation with a stranger, as somebody asked. We're going to start with what I would consider to be the most distilled form of story structure. This is called the ABT model, which stands for and, but, therefore. As in, there was this and this, but this new thing happened, therefore this resulted. Or alternatively, we know this and this, but we don't know this yet. Therefore, we did this to figure it out. The abstract we just read was essentially in this format. This model actually goes back centuries. It was first put into effect by philosopher Georg Hegel in the late 1700s, early 1800s with the Hegelian dialectic. But even Aristotle identified a kind of tripartite structure to argument. So this concept is basically as old as human philosophy, that you present a thesis or a proposition, you counter it with an antithesis, a counter proposition, and then you arrive at a new synthesis, a new thesis, and you can continue from there. Incidentally, this is the structure that we use in scientific papers. The introduction, where you introduce your proposition and your counter proposition. We know this, but we don't know this. And then the hypothesis or new thesis, therefore we think this, and here's what we did to figure it out. And then your methods, results, and discussion elaborate on the synthesis. This approach was actually made famous, also made famous by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the co-creators of South Park. They call it the rule of replacement. Anytime you find the word and in your storyline, you replace it with the word but or therefore. And that creates a continuous buildup of conflict and resolution. Because if you have and, that means your story is droning on without setting up conflict resolution. It's not as dramatic, it's not as interesting. So using and, but, therefore, keeps it really interesting. And watch any episode of South Park or any other TV show that you find really engaging, you'll find that that structure is present in the storyline. So let's come back to my example from my dissertation work. Recall the main point that I wanted to convey about my dissertation research to an audience of mixed biologists, that lizard body size correlates with temperature both today and in the past as well. Here's how I recently used ABT structure to begin an abstract for a scientific conference. This was an abstract that I actually submitted. Metabolic theory predicts that maximum body size should correlate with environmental temperature in reptiles. And, the and is implied, this has been demonstrated in extant lizards. So we know this and this in living lizards. But what we don't know, the relationship between these variables has not been investigated over deep time scales. That's the existing lingering problem. Here, another way of saying therefore, I test the hypothesis that body size range in assemblages of fossil lizards correlates with transitions in environmental temperature over geologic timescales, the new synthesis. Now, what about my audience for the general public? What if I'm speaking to a group of kids? And my main point is that we can use the past to predict the future. How might I rephrase that ABT with that main point in mind? Also using less jargon, how about climate change is threatening animals today and we need to help them? But it's hard to predict how it will threaten animals in the future based only on what's happening right now because climate is changing so rapidly. Therefore, we should look at how climate change affected animals in the past to predict how it will affect them in the future. Very straightforward. Still accurate, focusing on a different aspect of the study, and of course, presented in language that will be more accessible for the kids. Note that your main point often becomes the therefore of your ABT, the last part of your ABT statement. So ABT statements are great for abstracts, as I just demonstrated. They're also great for elevator pitches. If you need to summarize your work in 30 seconds and initiate a conversation, especially if you're initiating a conversation with a stranger. Great for starting grants or reports, for social media posts, if you need just a short, pithy statement. And any other short form of communication. And then of course, you can also incorporate this into long form communication, like writing entire technical papers by using ABT statements throughout. So next time you're writing a scientific paper, if you want to make it more interesting, think about using and, but, therefore structure throughout the paper, especially when you're introducing every new section of your paper. And that will make it much more engaging because you'll be making it clear to your reader the whole way what we didn't know, how we tested it, and what we know now, what we discovered. A lot of times when papers overlook that or they don't include ABT structure, that's when the paper can start to get lost in the weeds, or also just be really difficult to read because you're trying to figure out, wait, why were they doing this and why should I care? ABT establishes up front why we're doing this and why you should care. So with this in mind, let's look at another example of a scientific peer-reviewed paper. This is abstract 2 in your file. So take a moment to read this abstract and ask yourself, is the main point of this scientific abstract easy to understand for you as a scientist? Is ABT structure present or not? All right. So even if you haven't had a chance to finish reading the entire thing, just reading the first couple sentences, do you think ABT structure is present here? Please enter your thoughts in the chat. Do you see ABT structure present in this abstract? Yes, great, a lot of yeses. Absolutely. Taphonomic studies regularly employ animal analogs for human decomposition due to ethical restrictions relating to the use of human tissue. Great. By the way, you don't necessarily have to have an and at the beginning. You can have it or not, as long as you're just establishing, here's what we know already. However, that's the but statement. The validity of using animal analogs in soil decomposition studies is still questioned. However, this is the lingering problem. Therefore, implied, this study compared the decomposition of skeletal muscle, etc. So here's what we know. Here's the lingering problem. Therefore, here's what we did. Absolutely. Beautiful ABT structure. I am not a physical anthropologist, but I had no trouble figuring out what the point of this study was and why they were doing it. Now let's look at another study. Take a moment to read this abstract and ask, is the main point of this scientific abstract clear to you? Is there ABT structure present or not? Okay, so I already see some responses coming in. Do you see ABT structure present in this article? A lot of people are saying no. They tell you what they are doing, but not why it matters or what gap in the literature it is filling. The title suggests that there should be a more concise point. Great observations. Is the novel contribution of this study clear? It's kind of Barry. The conclusions should be the objectives. Yeah, I agree. This abstract could basically be inverted and it would be a lot more clear. It needs to be reshuffled a bit. Oops. Here we go. So now we're going to get back into breakout rooms and we're going to shuffle it up a bit. You might end up with the same people or some different people. And in groups of 2 to 3, we're going to take this abstract 3 in your file. And I would like you to think about what would be the main point of this abstract for a general audience. It's a really, really awesome abstract, really cool study. I was really excited when I read it, but it took me a few minutes reading it to figure out what the point of it actually was, because you're right, there is no ABT structure. So let's rephrase this abstract to make it more clear. What would be the main point for a general audience? And I'd like you with your group to create a 2 to 3 sentence ABT summary of this abstract for a general audience to clearly communicate that main point. It doesn't have to be a perfect polished ABT statement. Just focus on rearranging the pieces that you need. And if you can, maybe rephrase it in more general terms that most people would understand if there's any jargon in there that you think should be rephrased. But the most important thing, restructure it so that it has some ABT so that that main point is clearly communicated for a general audience. And I will put this file in the chat one more time here, just in case anybody doesn't have it yet. This is abstract 3 in your file of abstracts. And we are now on page 4 of the worksheet. So distilling the main point and using ABT structure. So now I'm going to pause the recording and open up the breakout rooms again. Okay, welcome back. So now that you've all had a chance to brainstorm an ABT statement for this abstract, would anybody like to share their ABT statement in the chat? If you'd like to share it, please enter it in the chat. I'll just point out that the therefore was pretty easy to parse out from this abstract, as we mentioned before, but however, the but part of the ABT was not clearly stated. The existing problem, like what got you interested in this problem? Why did you choose to investigate this particular thing? Why did you work on this particular population in this particular region? None of that was answered in the abstract as it was written. So this is actually a common issue in scientific abstracts. Very, very often scientists will state what was already known and then jump right into what they did without clarifying the lingering problem that they were addressing. So in your own writing, I encourage you to make sure that you are always clarifying not just the main point, but the problem, the existing problem, lacking knowledge that you're addressing, because that tells people why they should care about your work. Okay, we have one example of an ABT here for this abstract. The rivers of northern Chile have high boron concentrations, and modern research suggests that boron causes belly aches. Great, picked up on the title. But we didn't know how much of a concentration, we didn't know how much concentration they were exposed to. Therefore, we tested mummy hair in this population. Great, awesome. I can share with you my own ABT statement that I wrote for this abstract. I'll put it here in the chat so that you can see it in writing. Here's what I came up with. The rivers of northern Chile are known to contain high concentrations of boron, but it is not known whether this contamination impacted the ancient populations living in the nearby Atacama Desert from 3000 BC to 1500 AD. Therefore, we tested boron concentration in strands of hair from representative mummies. We found significant levels in all of the samples, indicating that prolonged boron contamination afflicted these populations. So that was me just basically rearranging the information. Of course, if I was communicating this to a general audience, I would rephrase some of that and take out some of the jargon, but you get the idea. Great. So if you would like to learn more about using the ABT framework, I encourage you to check out the books of Randy Olson. Some of you may have heard of him before. Randy is a scientist turned filmmaker. He was a tenured professor, but then decided to leave academia to focus on science communication, and is also a filmmaker. He makes some documentaries, and he's written 3 books. If you read only one book, I recommend his most recent one, Houston, We Have a Narrative, because it has extensive examples of using ABT and a lot of great guidance on how to do it, as well as some other useful templates. So I highly encourage that resource. I encourage you to check out that resource. All right, the last thing we're going to think about in thinking about how to distill stories is building complexity stepwise. What do I mean by that? Well, in addition to thinking about distilling, we also need to think about how to build complexity back up once we've distilled our main point, the main thing that we want to get across. This is a paper by a friend and colleague of mine, Anna Kipnis, who is a senior gameplay designer, was working at Double Fine Productions for a while. I actually ran a symposium on science through narrative, engaging broad audiences at a biology conference, and Anna was one of our speakers. She also wrote this paper, Communication Through Playful Systems, Presenting Scientific Worlds the Way a Game Might Do. And in this paper, which is available open access online, Anna describes how when you design a game, you don't usually throw all the rules at the player up front. You introduce maybe just the first rule or two that they need to know to get started, and then you introduce the rest of the rules as they go, as they start playing the video game, so that you entice the player and they can learn along the way. But if you throw all the rules at them up front, it's going to be really daunting and they might not want to play it. I don't know about you, but even when I'm playing board games, I don't want to read all the instructions first. I would rather just start playing and figure it out as we go, or have someone explain it to me as we go through it. So you can think about communicating science in a similar way. You don't need to give all the rules of the game, so to speak, up front. You just need to give your audience, your players, enough information to get started, to start playing the game with you, to come start exploring this new world that they're not familiar with you, and you can explain the rules as you go. So how could we build complexity stepwise when talking about our science? For example, when we're having a conversation with someone, coming back to the question about how can we figure out which details to distill, and maybe how could we apply this to talking to strangers about our science? Perfect example. If you had met me 4 or 5 years ago and you asked me, Sarah, what do you work on? I would have immediately launched into some convoluted explanation about how I study fossil lizards that lived from 66 to 23 million years ago in the western interior of the US. And I study how their body size changed as mean annual paleotemperature rose and fell. And a lot of them were glyptosaurian lizards, and et cetera, et cetera. And I probably lost some of you already, even though I already explained my research to you before. But if you launch right into the details, it's really overwhelming. It's really hard to access that. Now, when people ask me, what do? I simply start with, I study how climate change impacts animals over time. Plain simple. That's what I shared with you when I was talking about my favorite stories. Very relatable terms. This is the overarching concept, overarching theme of my work. And for 98% of the people that I talk to, this is all that they need to know. This is probably all that they care to know. And that's fine. 98% of the time, this is as much detail as I want to go into anyway. I don't want to have to explain all the details every single time. So thinking about what is the primary level of complexity, the most important thing for most people to understand about your work, that's level number one. Then if they ask me, oh, really? What kind of animals? Specifically reptiles. Really? What kind of reptiles? Specifically lizards and crocs. Where? In North American interior from 66 to 23 million years ago, over about 40 million years. Oh, cool. And what changes are you looking at? Reconstructing body size, looking at how body size changed over time with temperature, et cetera. So you see how I'm tiering, T-I-E-R, I am tiering by levels the complexity that I introduce to people. Most important thing, and then the most relevant details after that. I really encourage you to think about this with your own work. Think about next time someone asks you, what do you do? And this might be different depending on whether it's another scientist or a general audience member. I use this for both. I use the first level of complexity, whether it's a technical or general audience, that helps everybody orient themselves immediately, no matter who they are or what their background is. Excuse me. And then which level of detail I go into after that might depend on who I'm talking to. But it really, really helps. And it also reminds you that you don't have to be concerned about telling someone all of the details of your work every time. You only need to choose the most salient pieces of information for that conversation. This is exactly what museum exhibit developers do, by the way. The most important point will be the largest font, the 128-point font, so to speak. And then the second most important point will be under that, the 64-point font. Third is the 48 font, etc. So they put the most important stuff in the biggest letters, and then the next and next and next important stuff in smaller letters, so that everybody, if they're just passing by, gets the most important point, and the others can get the rest of the details if they actually want to stop and read them. So with the example that we looked at before with this abstract about the mummies and the boron contamination in hair, we determined the main point. Water contamination should be considered when studying ancient populations. And then what would the secondary level of complexity be? Maybe we found significant levels of boron concentrations in all the samples from this specific population that we studied, indicating that it afflicted these populations over a prolonged period of time. Third level of complexity, specifically, these were populations in the Atacama Desert from this time to this time. So you get the idea. So think about how you can tier the information that you want to convey to any particular audience. And you can use that in writing. You can especially use that in abstracts. You can especially use that in conversations. So to summarize our workshop today, everything we covered a lot of ground. We thought about how to connect with our science through our favorite stories. Consider your primary communication goal for your audience. Consider what's both ordinary and extraordinary about your content. Ask what if questions, fun what if questions to engage your audience with what you're sharing with them. Distill the main point for that particular audience. Use ABT structure to distill your story and build your complexity stepwise from there. You could also start with your ABT summary, by the way, and then build the complexity after that. The most important thing to remember is that you are connecting with people and you're distilling your content in order to inform and engage people. So if you'd like to learn more about science storytelling, I encourage you to check out my website. I have a bunch of sketch notes on my website from previous workshops that I've run, some with artists from Pixar, actually. These are some sketch notes from a visual storytelling workshop, which we'll be getting to in a couple weeks. And as I mentioned, we also ran a symposium, Science Through Narrative, Engaging Broad Audiences, at a biology conference a couple years ago, 3 years ago now. And all of the papers from that symposium are now available open access. And all those links to the papers plus sketch notes from that symposium are also available on my website. The speakers from that symposium, not just the video game developer, but we also had animators, museum directors, film artists, graphic designers, dance theater people, multimedia outreach, all kinds of people from all different career stages and backgrounds. So there's a great variety of perspectives there. I encourage you to check those papers out. They're all peer reviewed, but they're all written for a broad readership. So I've used them with high schoolers and they get a lot out of it. And I have one of my own papers in there, Making Science Meaningful for Broad Audiences Through Stories. We're going to get into this content a lot more next week in our second workshop on science story development, when we talk more about how to develop a longer form story using story structure. So we'll talk much more about that topic next week. And on my website, you'll also find lots of different resources that are available. Some podcasts or webinars that I've done with other organizations. Also some links to other resources that I recommend. Pixar in a Box in particular is a great resource. It's a whole module, actually series of modules that Pixar Animation Studios made with Khan Academy. It's all available completely free online. Lots of really fun, engaging videos that talk about some really, really great story fundamentals in a really fun way. Lots of people to acknowledge that have helped me brainstorm and test out this material over the years. Many folks at Pixar Animation Studios, the UC Museum of Paleontology, people all over the place. And I especially also want to thank Vienna Lam, Christine Carino, and Marin Pilloud for inviting me to run this workshop series with you. Thank you all so much for your participation. I'm really excited to get to work with you, not just today, but for the next 2 weeks as well. This is the first time I've been able to work with the same group for the whole series 3 weeks in a row. What a great opportunity. I feel so fortunate. So thank you so much. And I'll leave you with this final slide. If you'd like to join my mailing list to hear about other upcoming workshops, webinars, events available to the public, you can join my mailing list through this QR code, or you can just go to my website and find it there. And also, if you can take a minute after today's workshop and after the other workshops the next couple weeks to share your feedback on what you found really helpful or any suggestions that you have, I would really appreciate your thoughts in this anonymous survey. And there's another QR code for that as well. The link for that, or the address for that survey, is also in your worksheet. And there's a hyperlink there too, if you want to just click on it. And of course, you can find me on social media. Please feel free to reach out to me through email or through my website. And with that, it is 12 noon my time, 3 p.m. Eastern time. So any of you who need to go, thanks so much for coming. I will see you next week. And if any of you want to stick around for a couple more minutes and ask a few more questions, I'm happy to stick around for a bit. And with that, I'll turn it back over to my co-hosts from SCWIST.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah. This was a fantastic workshop. We're really looking forward to the workshops for next week. And if you need tickets, or people who are interested to join the forthcoming workshops, please, I'm going to put in the chat the SCWIST website for events, and then you can just register from there. All right, I'm staying on to listen to the questions. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your lunch. If you're in the West Coast anyway.
So I'm happy to take any questions from those of you who are still here for a few more minutes if you'd like to enter them in the chat. But meanwhile, I'd love to hear from our SCWIST host. Tell me a little bit more. I know you mentioned a bit about the work that you do at the beginning, but I'm curious to hear, do you run other workshops about professional development skills or even science communication specifically very often, or is this something that you're just starting?
Oh, we actually have monthly workshops, but this is the first month that we're having 3 workshops in a row. Um, and yeah, we don't only have science communications workshops. We have well, let me see, professional develop career oriented workshops. Yeah, and we run weekly brown bags with a variety of topics in STEM, and panels
Awesome.
also, at least monthly panels. Yeah.
Wow, you do a lot. That's fantastic. And I see a comment from Vienna. If anyone has any questions about getting more involved with outreach, we can speak to opportunities. Vienna, would you like to make any comments?
Yeah, so with SWIST, we do a lot of outreach, and now that almost everything's virtual, I think it's a lot easier for folks to try it out with, with SWIST. We organize a lot of outreach events with young kids, high schoolers, some undergrads. Really, it's folks of all ages. And with AAFS, right now we have an ad hoc committee looking to identify all the members within our anthropology section that may be interested in getting involved and doing more outreach. Perhaps Marion could speak to kind of where we're at with a lot of these things right now. We're collecting information, we're trying to provide training, we're trying to create a hub so people who do want to get involved or are all already being involved can get together.
And we're trying to do some outreach to communities surrounding the AAFS annual scientific meeting, and then just also trying to connect people with the schools or other community events who are looking for this type of outreach. Anyway, I'll let Sarah answer the questions that are coming up in the chat.
That's all fantastic to hear. Thank you so much. I'm now even more honored to be part of your programming with all the great work that you do. So we did have a few more questions come in. Are you going to touch on visual communication as well? Absolutely. That's going to be the topic of the 3rd workshop 2 weeks from today. So next week will be on science story development, long form science storytelling. And then the 3rd week will be all about visual science communication. Do you have any advice about how to get more involved in science communication if we are coming from a non-academic context? Great question. Well, as you just heard from our SCWIST co-hosts, they have opportunities to get involved with science outreach. Involved with science communication, I mean, gosh, especially now that everything is online, it's, I would say, easier than ever to get involved with science communication. Great, I just see that the website for SCWIST, some of their programming in terms of, especially for mentoring, that website was just entered into the chat. If you are looking for opportunities to get involved with science communication, I think starting with SCWIST and looking at their opportunities is a great starting point. But also, if you just Google science communication opportunities, you will find so many. If you want just a condensed list of like recommendations, feel free to check out my website. I have a lot of programs highlighted there, or I actually have a list that you can download of science communication resources and opportunities that you can join. Off the top of my head, I mean, there are often a lot of programs locally. I would recommend that you check out any science museums or nonprofit organizations that are local to you, or even like major ones online, because a lot of them have online opportunities now as well. Yeah, I would just do some internet browsing because there are so many, and it just depends on what type of communication activity you're interested in doing. If you want to put together content that will be put out on the web and lots of people can see it at once, that's one route. Or if you're more interested in doing like one-on-one mentoring or giving presentations or webinars that will be open to the public, but maybe reaching a small group of people at a time, that's another route. There are just so many ways that you can do it. So I'd think about what type of activity specifically would you like to do? And then you can narrow your search from there. If you're looking to do some writing and maybe get a piece published, like a commentary piece or an editorial, a lot of publications for general readership like Scientific American or the PLOS Public Library of Science, SciComm blog, they're always looking for contributions. So you could reach out to those editors as well. There are so many ways to get involved. So it just depends on what kind of activity you're looking to do. And if you have any more specific questions or recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to make more specific suggestions based on your interests. Oh, great. If you have kids and want some fun activities, Vienna just shared a link to some of Science World's resources. Science World, there's several across Canada. I've actually run workshops at several of them, including the one in Vancouver. Also a great institution, great resource. Let's see, we have a few other questions here. What is your opinion on jargon? How can I tone down the jargon without dumbing down the material? Great question. Well, I would say the easiest way to kind of train yourself to avoid jargon is to talk about your research with people who are not scientists, or at least people who are not in your field, and just ask them, what was any of that confusing to you, or were any of those terms unfamiliar, or even if it's a word that you recognize, but maybe I'm using it in a context that you're not used to, where did you get lost? And we're going to talk more about that next week when we're developing our stories as well. So just try it out on other people. Another really great resource that I recommend, let me pull it up here and then I can share it in the chat. If any of you are familiar with Randall Munroe, who is the author of the webcomic XKCD, he's a scientist himself and he makes great comics about science and scientists. He's written several books, and all of his books are really great examples of explaining complicated things in general terms, not using jargon. And someone actually made this great filter called the Upgoer 5 text editor. So Upgoer 5 was Randall Munroe's way of explaining how a rocket works. The Upgoer, it goes up. So somebody made a text editor, and I'll put that website in the chat here. Yeah, splasho.com/Upgoer5. The Upgoer 5 text editor, actually, I can just share it here so you can see how it works. This is a really great resource. So in the Upgoer 5 text editor, you could enter something like reptile body size increased with temperature. Okay, so notice how it highlighted some words in red, not because they were misspelled, but because those words are not included in the list of the 10,000 most commonly used words in English. Text editor will help you narrow it down to only words that are on that list of the 10,000 most commonly used words in English. So it'll highlight anything not on that list, and then you can keep replacing it with other synonym words, or like try to think of another way to say it until nothing is highlighted in red. So temperature, let's try heat. Oh, no, really? Heat is not on there? Okay, warm. Warm is okay. Okay, increased, how about went up? And reptile, how about just animals? Animals who can't make heat. Oh yeah, heat wasn't okay. Anyway, you get the idea. So you can keep replacing words until you have only words that are like very simple, that are some of the 10,000 most commonly used words. This is taking it to an extreme. Of course, you know, what you're going to end up with would be something that would be understandable probably to a kindergartner. Maybe you don't want to go quite that simplistic, but this is really, really useful. You kind of swing all the way the other way, and then you can kind of backtrack and end up somewhere in the middle, depending on the audience that you're trying to reach. If you are trying to reach kindergartners, this is a fantastic resource. So just Google Upgoer 5 text editor, and you will find that website. Okay, there were some other questions back here. How do you generalize or simplify your research for a general audience when what is new about your work is molecular mechanisms? Awesome. Great question. How do we make molecular mechanisms relatable and interesting for a general audience? I would encourage you to think about not the fact that these are molecules, but think about what are the relationships between these molecules? How do those molecules interact with each other? And are there any parallels between those molecular interactions and the way people might interact with each other? I would start from there, because stories are all about relationships. It's finding the familiar relationships in things. And that can be true whether it's animals or molecules or systems or planets, doesn't matter. It's all about relationships. So think about what are the familiar relationships represented by these molecular interactions, and that might help out. And we're also going to talk a lot more about characters, choosing the right characters for your story, how to make those characters relatable, and how to put that into a story, how to put a story together about those characters. We'll get more into that next week. Another question, what is a good way to communicate problems about something in particular when your intended audience is also the thing you studied? Communicate about problems about something in particular when your intended audience is also the thing you studied.
I can be a little more descriptive if you want.
Yeah,
So,
could you elaborate on that, please?
yeah, I was trying to like figure out a way to word it. So basically, I did a lot of research into cognitive bias. And so sometimes that can point out issues within a field of study, but how do you, like, what's a good way to communicate those issues without being like, our field sucks, when like that's not the intention, but like you are trying to point out problems to the field. And so like the audience is the people you did the study on.
Mm. So how to tell people about cognitive bias without telling them you're the biased people and you're the problem?
Correct.
Very interesting question. Well, yeah, that's a fun one. That is an interesting question, but totally doable. I mean, while it's possible that you may have studied that particular audience that you're also trying to reach in your studies about cognitive bias is a pretty ubiquitous thing among human beings. So when you're communicating about the cognitive bias, you don't necessarily need to use that particular audience as an example. You could use any other hypothetical group of people or situation to talk about cognitive bias. And most likely, I mean, there are a couple ways you could do it. You could just talk about another group of people and trust that the people in the audience will make the connection on their own. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Oh, haha, I do that too sometimes, don't I? Or you can also go the humility route and offer an example of yourself. So situations in which you also had cognitive bias and how you recognized that and how you corrected for it, because we've all had cognitive bias. Everybody has bias. Everyone has cognitive bias at some point. It's just a matter of, are you aware of it or not? So those would be my two most immediate recommendations. Either use a hypothetical, or you could use yourself, or maybe even an example of a close friend or colleague or relative, something that you observed personally in a personal experience, something that your audience might be able to relate to.
Thank you.
Or you could even just say scientists in general, like how many of you have been in this situation where you realized after the fact that you made this assumption? I don't think that anyone would perceive that as a personal attack. It's just, haha, yeah, we all do this. So yeah, several ways that you could approach that. Another question, we often have challenges with our early researchers group to present our research using this. It's really great and requires a lot of thought. Definitely would recommend for students and other researchers. Oh, thank you for that comment. Another question or comment, I talked to a group of third graders and they not only knew what amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is, they also understood what it does to the body. That's amazing, because I don't even know what amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is. I know what some of those words or terms mean, but I've never heard of that myself. So, hey, that's awesome. Those third graders were really well informed. Terrific. All right. Well, if there are no more questions for now, thank you all so much for coming today. Thanks for sticking around for extended conversation afterwards. I really enjoyed this, and I'm really excited to work with you all again next week and the week after. So I'll see you all next week for Science Story Development. And until then, have a great weekend and a great week next week. I'll see you next Friday.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Take care.